is if we had joined the GNU or were invited now to join the GNU, we would be saying we will not enter unless there's going to be the re-establishment of the Scorpions.
Welcome back to Born Free. My name is Kumalo, and today we are going with the hard-hitting interviews. We're going to be speaking to the people at the top. We're going to be speaking to the people who are making the decisions and leading the future of South Africa. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Otsile and Nkadimeng. How are you doing today?
I'm all right, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. And today we have the privilege of being joined by the National Chairperson of ActionSA, Michael Beaumont. How are you doing?
I'm good. I think the privilege is mine. I think these kind of podcasts are the future, and I always get really excited to be on one of these.
We want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for giving us your time. I want to start particularly with where ActionSA is kind of making big strides, the constitutional amendment that's recently been proposed of the scrapping of deputy ministers. I want to ask why. What necessarily activated that, and what necessarily meant that there was a need to change the way in which we're interacting? Moreover, I think there's very specific changes that are being made with the question of a vote of no confidence for ministers who are not performing, but also a question of ensuring that the people who are being elected into cabinet are being checked by Parliament prior to their election. What led to that? What gave birth to that? And necessarily, why did ActionSA decide to utilize that as one of its points moving forward?
Well, I think ActionSA has taken up a really interesting role in Parliament because we did not join this GNU. We elected to stay out of it despite invitation. And the opposition in Parliament between MK and the EFF is really at 6s and 7s. They don't know what they're doing. So as a 6-seat unofficial opposition, ActionSA is having to carry a lot of weight in that Parliament. And there's a lot of really important work that team of MPs of ours have been doing. We think this is a particularly important one, and not because getting rid of all deputy ministers is going to change the country, but it's an important symbol, and symbols matter. We live in a country where we have a government that lives large and people that don't, and it really has gotten outrageous to the point where, more money is spent on VIP protection than on crime intelligence. It is outrageous. We do need to be angry about this as a country. And what really has happened since this GNU came into being is that the ANC has continued like nothing changed in May last year. And they've been enabled by a group of coalition partners who were just so happy to climb into the back of those VIP-driven cars. They didn't really take notice of the need for a coalition agreement or anything that kind of managed how power was going to be used in that arrangement. So whenever the president makes a decision, it's just the prerogative of the president. And I think South Africans have seen the abuses of powers of presidents, that just because they have a constitutional right to do something doesn't mean it should be done in that kind of manner. And we're looking at a scenario where we have so many deputy ministers. If anyone, perhaps any listeners to your show, can tell me what a deputy minister does, I've been in politics 18 years, I can't tell you. They serve no earthly function. And when the police minister was sent on paid vacation, neither one of his 2 deputy ministers could be elevated into the role, which again begs, what do these people exist for? So our view in removing them is partly about that, but it's also about saying that when you have a minister who's implicated, like we have so many at the moment, there needs to be an ability for Parliament to pass a motion of no confidence to remove a particular minister. Right now, you either remove the president or all of the ministers and nothing in between. And if a president is dragging their feet and removing someone who's implicated, Parliament should have the powers to act, and right now it doesn't. But our amendment goes one step further, and this is where it gets quite controversial for some people, to say that the president's choices for ministers should actually be subject to ratification by the Parliament. Now, some people feel like that's legislative overreach, perhaps. There's precedent in other countries for it, but let's look at the past few years. How well has executive authority worked for this country, where presidents can literally give you a Batibele Dlamini or Bheki Cele or any one of these individuals who are so grossly implicated, but the president says, I'm the president, so this is your person. Imagine a president who had to face scrutiny of the Parliament. Would they actually have put forward a Batibele Dlamini? I don't think they would have. And I think that's where we can start to raise the bar in South African politics, and that was some of the thinking behind our idea.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because, what we know between the GNU partners, or what we know as a coalition really between the ANC and the DA, was the DA keeps forcing this idea of they're getting rid of corrupt ministers, and they've celebrated the fact that they've been able to axe the minister or former minister of higher education. Thembi Simelane is still there. Gwede Mantashe, who's been implicated in state capture, very much still there. Time and time again, we've seen that ministers haven't necessarily had to deal with the accountability, nor as the president, as you've said. I'm interested now to hear, what do you necessarily view as these squabbles that keep happening, where there's a belief of we can get accountability and there's a celebration when one minister is removed, but the rest of implicated ministers remain? Because I think as a nation, we stand at a very weird impasse where now corruption has really become to the forefront. Of course, we have General Mkhwanazi, and I'll get into the commission later. But there really is a question of what does South Africa do and where should we be going, particularly with around the corruption, the lack of accountability, and the lack of action by presidents?
Well, I think we need to deal with one thing first, and it's my view, but I think this GNU is just a huge failure. And I start with that because there was a failure to negotiate how power was to be shared. Every learning, and we've undertaken many as a party, going to countries that coalition is the norm, and they all tell you one thing, is you need to have a coalition agreement up front. And that statement of intent is not a coalition agreement. It barely even scratches the surface. So really, for 2 weeks, all they managed to do was negotiate who was going to get what position. And that's disappointing, because if you've had so much institutional memory of the ANC eroding the line between party and state, change was only ever going to happen if coalition partners came in there and actually forced real changes structurally to the government. And one of those is around corruption that you're talking about, because, yeah, people go and celebrate the removal of a minister, but then they go and sit in a cabinet with all the other implicated ministers. Like that solved anything. Or like that solves the fact that there are people who've been appointed in positions because of how they serve political parties and not the residents they're meant to serve. So these things are not changing, and really what's being celebrated is the cosmetic. That's why at times we've called this an Instagram government. Because it really loves this little posts and videos and clever little sloganeering. But actually, what is changing? The economy hasn't changed direction. The fight against corruption hasn't moved in any way. The criminal justice system is more broken than it was. And really, all of the indicators are moving in the wrong direction for us. And what it came down to answer your question in a more helpful manner, is if we had joined the GNU, or were invited now to join the GNU, we would be saying we will not enter unless there's going to be the re-establishment of the Scorpions and a Chapter 9 institution independent of executive authority that is free and able to investigate and ensure the prosecution of corrupt cases. Because the State Capture Commission of Inquiry remains nothing more than a paperweight right now.
Yeah.
A 6,000-page, 2 billion rand waste of time. And I think that's deeply disappointing. And the only way that's ever going to change is if real pressure is brought to bear on the ANC.
Raymond Zondo recently made a statement to the Sunday Times, and he spoke quite significantly at the fact that he was disheartened when he was having to swear in many ministers who had been implicated historically and MPs. I think now, looking particularly at this new Commission of Inquiry, what is the view from ActionSA? Do you guys think the president made the best decision? But also, what do you guys hope to see out of this Commission of Inquiry, with the fact that now we know it is happening, we know it's about to start in August, and that in 6 months we'll potentially get a report that will say something?
Do you think it'll happen in 6 months?
Oof, the hard...
So let me ask.
Don't bet the farm.
Yeah, I wouldn't. And if you do, check what's in the couch first.
You're the shade.
No, I think for us, it was the absence of a decision. A commission of inquiry is the president's go-to when he wants to kick something down the road. Senzo Mkhunu is a long-time ally of the president. It's very clear that there was a refusal on his part to be able to take a tough decision in respect of him, because he's acted much more softly in respect to this matter than he has against the Minister of Higher Education, by way of an example. And it's just another commission of inquiry when we haven't really got answers about what happened on the first one. And I think South Africans are looking at this process amid a 700 million rand national dialogue and saying, you know, these are processes about processes. In fact, if you think about the South African citizen, they see the complaint about corruption by General Mkhwanazi, and in response, they get to pay billions of rands for another commission of inquiry to do nothing. They were better off if this hadn't even been raised in the first instance. So I think it is disappointing. We don't support it at all, because let's be real, if you or I are charged with a crime, there's an investigation, we get taken to court, hopefully someone gets prosecuted, etc. If a minister like Senzo Mkhunu gets charged, there's a commission of inquiry. It's like special justice for particular people. And there's been way too much special justice going on in our country.
Shifting gears a little bit, I think it's fairly obvious that there's no love lost between ASA and the ANC at the moment. But there is quite a lot of disappointment in the South African public that a party as good as ActionSA, this is coming from their voters, did not opt to go into the government. Because right now, the impetus that the public has put on the GNU is, though it's a dysfunctional government, grand coalition, whatever you want to call it, at least there are people in there trying to fix the mess right now. And the general perception is it's better you be inside trying to do the work than outside not contributing to the solution generation of government. I wanted to know, is ActionSA considering, with the ANC now reviewing the GNU on their August 1st NEC, which at the time of this recording has not yet happened, would ActionSA take up an opportunity to enter the government should the ANC offer it?
Well, we've always indicated that we're open. I think we're quite clear about that. We were open when we were engaged in June 2024, and we remain open now. The thing, though, and this is the part where I remain skeptical, is because we would have conditions before we would join a GNU. And it looks like the ANC doesn't want conditions, they want cheerleaders. They want people who will cheer them on as they continue doing what they've always done, like nothing happened in May last year. And their current GNU partners appear really keen and able to play that kind of role. We don't see it that way. We see that if we're going to lend our support towards a government, there have to be real reforms. And there are no reforms taking place at all. So South Africans, might have started this process having warm and fuzzy feelings about the GNU, and they certainly did. That's already starting to shift quite a lot. Yeah. Because here we sit at the highest unemployment levels in 4 years. We're about to get hammered with economic growth on Friday when we get a 40% tariff imposed on exports to the country with the biggest trade surplus that we have in the world. And there is no economic policy being changed. So it's literally business as usual and multi-party delivery of failed ANC politics. And it's my opinion that the parties in that GNU are going to pay the price for that, because when South Africans brought the ANC to under 40% in this last election, they didn't do it with the hope that a whole bunch of people would come in and just help them continue what they did before. And we didn't want to play that role. If there's going to be a real negotiation of a proper coalition with real power sharing, limitations of executive authority, and an agreed program of policy reform, that's something we'd be open to. But based on what we've seen, I don't think that's the kind of partner the ANC is looking for. So I think they'll stay with their wife and try and make that arrangement work for them, which is good for them. But I think we also looked at the scenario to say, the GNU is 71% of the South African parliament. ActionSA in there is going to do what exactly? Because, people say we should go in and join it. I mean, when last did you hear anything that one of those parties in the GNU had actually done? It's the DA and the ANC. That's what that coalition is. And everyone else in that arrangement really is, quite frankly, on the periphery. We think we're doing really good work in opposition right now. And we'll serve where we can serve South Africans the best, and I think that's where we are.
But now looking with the lens to the 2026/maybe 2027 local government elections, the ANC right now is strategically positioned in most municipalities that when they lose majority, but are still significantly the largest party. And so anyone wishing to work in a coalition arrangement will have to work with the ANC. Looking at Johannesburg, who are the main partners that ActionSA is looking towards working with, keeping in mind that the DA and Helen Zille are coming in an election where the MK party is most likely to fracture the ANC and EFF vote? How does ActionSA see that playing out? Would you be willing to work with the DA or the ANC or both if they offered it to you guys?
So I think first thing, I don't think the ANC is going to be the largest party in Johannesburg after this election for all the reasons you just mentioned. And I think that's where it starts to get really interesting. But to answer your question, we used to be a party that before an election made a determination saying we'll never work with these guys, we'll only work with those guys, and that's our story. And that's what we used to do, and we thought that was quite clever. But the thing about being young as a political party is you've got to grow up and mature a little bit. And we've undergone a bit of a maturation because we suddenly discovered that the people we thought were friends in Tshwane were actually failing horrifically. and the people who were enemies in Joburg, etc. So, we had to kind of reframe our understanding of things and say, no, if you're going to be mature in coalitions, you must look towards that municipality in question and make a decision about which configuration of parties after the election will deliver stability and service delivery. And I say that because in local government, leaders of individual parties make a huge part of the impact. You can have an arrangement like we have in Tshwane right now, that's getting on like a house on fire. But in Joburg, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
And you can't say that we'll work with these guys and never these guys, etc. So we're going to take a bit more of a mature approach that we think it's mature anyway, and study the lay of the land a bit more. I think we need an election result really to make that kind of decision, and we need an election campaign to listen to what people are saying. But the answer to your question is we will be open to work with political parties that can pull together the right kind of coalition based on the right kind of reasons, stability and service delivery. And we're not going to make proclamations about one way or the other. An interesting part of your question, which I know you weren't asking, but I'll go there unsolicited anyway.
It was a hook.
Yeah, why not? Is the idea of coalition politics now is something that we're all having to get used to and grow up with. Because actually, you can have someone who's a wonderful singles tennis player, but they can't play doubles. And I'll give you the example of Helen Zille. Now, I don't think she's a wonderful tennis player, singles tennis player. But what I will say is that she has been the individual figure behind the collapse of every governance arrangement in Gauteng since the 2021 elections, her personally. Even when her own structures were wanting to enter into a coalition.
Sure.
To give you the example of Joburg, because I mean, she stands for Joburg and now she professes to love Joburg, but let's drop some truth now. In the last round of negotiations, ActionSA was willing to give up 2 of our 3 positions to the Patriotic Alliance to restore a majority behind Paul Palatse. Every structure agreed to it, every party agreed to it. The provincial guys and the DA signed off. Helen killed that deal personally.
Ooh, sure.
Now, the fact that we have Dada Marrero and the problems from which she says she now wants to rescue Johannesburg, it's ironic because she played a big part in the need for us having to be rescued in the first instance. But secondly, the giant question is going to be asked, who's going to work with Helen Zille in coalition as an individual if this is her track record in coalition?
Sure.
I want to explore firstly a philosophy that I continue to hear, but also then what's really happened on the ground. So it seems as though looking at the budget, looking at what's happened in Joburg, ActionSA stance has been that it's an issue-by-issue basis at the moment under the current guise of what's happening. And now we've seen what's happened with the ANC, particularly within Joburg, with the removal of the speaker, which was a very interesting thing, and then it didn't, of course, pour over into Tshwane. Moving forward, as you say, coalitions are very much going to be about maturing, going to be about working together. How do you see particularly parties and particularly ActionSA playing this relationship moving forward? Do you think coalition governments moving forward are going to be more parties starting to say we're going to vote on an issue-by-issue basis? Or do you think what we're being exposed to now is actually going to lead to more solid agreements come the local government election?
It's a great question. I wish I could say it's going to go one way or the other, but I think the truth is some will go in one direction and some will go in the other. I sometimes think that the GNU would have been a whole lot better if the ANC had been kept as a minority government with a supply and demand kind of arrangement of votes. Yeah. Because, once you elect the president and you give executive authority to the ANC, they don't need you anymore, quite frankly. I mean, you got to vote for their budgets once a year and that kind of thing. But all the rest of the time, I mean, they literally can see you later kind of project. And I think a supply and demand relationship is actually really healthy. When Herman Mashaba was the mayor of Joburg, I served as his chief of staff for those 3 years. And that was a minority government. We had to reach across the aisle and get support on an issue-by-issue basis. And what it does is it keeps you honest. You've got to literally take every proposal that requires a majority decision and bring people in and say, this is what we're thinking. This is the benefit we think it could have. What are your thoughts and how can we get your support? And I think there is something really positive about that in keeping power in check, which otherwise doesn't happen in a majority coalition. So I'd like to see more of those kind of arrangements going on. But what you do see is political parties wanting to build the strongest possible numbers of coalition in the traditional sense for stability's sake. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better answer, but that's the way it seems to be playing out.
No, I mean, that's definitely understandable. I think the thing that becomes very interesting and the thing that I would be interested to hear is ActionSA performed really, really well in 2021, came onto the scene as was very big. 2024, the national election, didn't perform as well. And of course, there's reasons behind that you may be able to speak to. Looking forward to 2026 and potentially 2027, depending on when this election does take place. What are you guys particularly aiming for, and what are the key moments for you guys as a party? Because I think it'll be very interesting to see the difference between national and local elections, because once again, it feels like you guys are back once again in the public discourse. People are paying attention to what you're doing. You're extremely active. And you seem to be one of the few political parties without all the problems. I mean, if you look towards the DA, they're going through an election conference next year. The ANC in turmoil. The EFF really at the moment looks like a very strong Julius cult. And the MK is always having leadership issues. So when you look at it, it seems as though ActionSA has been the most stable party outside of the GNU, which is able to actually enact change. So what do you guys suspect, or what do you guys look forward to, particularly in this next election?
So to go back to the first part of that question, let me be clear, 2024 was disappointing for us. We were devastated by that result. But in politics, you don't get what's fair, you get what the voters give you. And you need to introspect on that, and you need to actually understand what it is you need to do better. I think there's a couple of observations about 2024. I think firstly, every party outside of MK was disappointed. And I think MK was such a disruptive factor in that election that it's almost like an anomaly election. You can't compare it to any other election. You've never had a former president stand and contest an election like that. So it really was a weird election that way. And I think also our involvement in that multi-party charter was very, very harmful to ActionSA. Because basically what happened was the DA used the multi-party charter to decampaign its own coalition partners. And they basically went to their core constituency in the middle-class suburban communities and said, well, don't buy retail when you can buy wholesale, just put us in. We're all working together, give it to us. So it was quite a disingenuous move on their part. But at the same time, by associating with parties like the DA and to some extent the Freedom Front Plus, you're tainted by association. And a lot of people in the townships who had voted for us in big numbers. In 2021, we were sitting at about 25% of Soweto. Looked at that and said, well, I don't want my vote to go to that. So they withheld it. So it was deeply a damaging kind of move, but a move at the time we took for what we believed to be the right reasons. We believed then, like we believe now, the future for South Africa is a coalition without the ANC. Because when people go on about this doomsday coalition, etc., soon they're going to realize that the doomsday coalition is any coalition with the ANC at the heart of it. Because actually, whether it's the ANC and the EFF and MK, or the ANC and the DA and the Freedom Front, it's the ANC. And that's the kind of thing that we really need to get past as well. For us, we have been busy. We got over that disappointment quickly, and we said, well, the only way is to put on our boots and work hard and show the South African people that we are their party. Because I think a lot of people went to the polls, voted for other parties, but if that party had fallen off a cliff, they would have voted for ActionSA. So we need to climb up the rankings in their hearts, and that's what we've been working really hard to do. And I think ahead of a local government election, there's a big opportunity there. You talked about what we want to achieve here. Everyone is focusing on this GNU, and local government is the biggest crisis in South Africa right now.
Yeah, sure.
We did some polling the other day, and it just blew my mind, because when you do polling in South African politics, the number one issue is jobs in the economy. It's been that way since I started. But now it's not. It's basic services. Electricity and water and sewage, these are the things that people are struggling with more now than ever before. Sure. Water outages make us miss load shedding because it really is severe. And people are fed up. So, being the party that can really speak to local government is what we want to be. We have leaders like Herman Mashaba and Athol Trollip who did it in broken places like Joburg and Nelson Mandela Bay. Dr. Nasipi Moya is doing it really well in the city of Tshwane, notwithstanding the absolute mountain there is still to climb there. But, if we can be the party that says, actually, we're a new party and we have a track record, we really hope that we can appeal to South Africans at that level in the local government elections.
You make an interesting analysis about the future of coalition building and that the Doomsday Coalition is actually anything that involves the ANC. But looking back pre-2017 to Jacob Zuma's Valentine's Day resignation, the leader of ActionSA, Herman Mashaba, was very strongly against President Zuma. And with the MK party growing at an exponential rate, by-election upon by-election, two questions come to mind that I have for you. One is, would you be willing to work with the MK party knowing the history of some of the people that occupy its leadership? But two, as a party in the political space, the growth of the MK party has been exponential. Do you think that this type of growth will continue? And if it does, where does that place you in terms of building a workable coalition?
So we actually haven't had much of an internal engagement from an ActionSA standpoint about whether we would or whether we wouldn't work with MK. I think MK is very difficult to understand. And from our point of view, we're studying it and we're trying to develop those views. So because we didn't find ourselves in a space where we had to answer that question necessarily before the 2024 election, we're taking it as something that we're going to be studying going forward. I think the configuration of leaders that they have, certainly would make it very hard for us to work with them because, it is a bit of a glossary of the State Capture Commission. And that makes it hard. It really is. But, the party is going to have to make that decision going forward. And I think what's really becoming interesting is there may need to be a developing body of politics in South Africa that says anything but the ANC. Because if you're going to change the legacy of the ANC, it might need you to work with the broadest possible number of political parties outside of the ANC and even accept there are many things we're going to have to agree to disagree on. So we're going to have to study that. We haven't ventilated as much as that as a party. Those are my views. But certainly as a party, we are becoming more and more acclimatized to the view that any coalition configuration where the ANC remains at the heart of it in national coalition politics is going to continue doing what their predecessors have done before.
But now I want to ask about the DA, because ActionSA and the DA have a relationship one can only reference maybe the Hatfields and the McCoys. Opposite ends, seemingly at each other's necks, but at some point that are going to have to work together. But I want to understand, why does ActionSA think the DA sees you as such a major threat to their growth and their base? But on a secondary level, how do you see yourselves working with the party that at every opportunity to stab you guys in the back, they've taken it?
Yeah, it's hard to say, actually, because, your observations is correct. The DA has literally operated to try and destroy ActionSA from day one. It's been their agenda. It's been the thing that gets them out of bed in the morning. In many ways, we get quite frustrated because people don't like the squabbling. But we often feel that we're the ones getting attacked every day and we're responding. But, I suppose many South Africans kind of feel like, when a parent is fed up of the children fighting and they just smack both of them because all your kids, So there is a cause and effect thing there. But, we've taken a bit of a decision as a party that we don't want to spend much more time in the future going on talking about other parties. We want to spend more time talking about us, our track record, what we're going to do in local government. And even to the point now that our responses to the daily attacks that we get from the DA are just going to be water off a duck's back. They can keep attacking us. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. And clearly, we must be doing something right if they spend this much time attacking us. And their polls must be saying that there's serious growth potential for ActionSA in their core voter constituencies as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't dedicate this much time to blowing air into something that they profess is not alive. So we look at it from that point of view. But we also look at it from a point of view of saying, if we are saying that we must be open to working with any configuration of parties in local government, that means being open to working with the DA as well. And I think it's going to be important that those relationships get defrosted and there is an openness and a willingness to talk, at least. Because what you don't ever want to see is a situation where voters are paying the price after an election because parties just couldn't get over their issues. That's silly, and I think we need to get past that.
When we looked particularly at Joburg, which is going to be, I feel like it's going to be the big battleground for 2026, Helen Zille has put her hat in the basket to say, no, she's here. She's going to be coming to Joburg and she's going to be doing it. And already it seems as though there's some people who are already taking on the belief. I mean, Prince Mashele on Sizwe Mpofu's podcast was big and saying, I would back Helen Zille if she did it. I'm interested to hear what particularly, if there is a strategy towards Helen Zille, because on one end, there's some political analysts who believe now every party has to funnel in their strongest candidates to Joburg. On the other end, there could be a belief that actually Joburg isn't the epicenter, that there's a lot more than Joburg, and even if Helen Zille does do well, that there may be a potential to look elsewhere. So I'm curious to know, firstly, one, what is the stance on the thought and the thinking around Helen Zille coming to Joburg? Because I think you've already said a lot in terms of how she's operated in coalitions. But now as the person who may become a mayor in the city, that's an interesting question. But I think secondly, what do you make of this idea that everyone's focusing on Joburg because that's where it's gotten the worst? That's where we've seen the ANC essentially gut out the state, gut out basic services. Do you think the people who come out on top are going to be the people who are going to be seen as the victors of the local election?
Yeah, I think there is an extent to which the kind of discourse has become about Joburg being the battleground. And, you know, we're going to try and shift that discourse a bit because Joburg is a big battleground and certainly one very close to our heart for obvious reasons. But at the same time, you know, let's not kid ourselves. You know, Buffalo City is a disaster. Polokwane, Bloemfontein, these are all places that are in desperate need. eThekwini. These are places that need leadership. And to kind of say to everyone else, sorry, guys, it's about Joburg and we'll get to you when we get to you, isn't the right approach politically. We won't be taking that approach. But I can tell you right now, we are going to be putting our strongest foot forward in Joburg as well. And we welcome the idea if there's going to be an upping of the ante in terms of candidates, because we feel that we have a number of options that'll be much, much stronger. And we also just feel that the idea that somebody did something 100 years ago in Cape Town, I'm not being funny. I mean, when Helen Zille took over Cape Town, the city had been governed more by the National Party than it had by the ANC.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to try and say that Cape Town in 2006 is like Joburg in 2025, I mean, you got to be certifiable to believe that. You also talk about a strategy for dealing with Helen Zille. Let Helen Zille deal with Helen Zille. She's done it so many times. Give her a microphone, give her a loudhailer, and she will offend as many people as humanly possible in the course of that election campaign. And we'll leave her to it. We're going to focus on what we've got to offer. ActionSA is led by the only person who has led the turnaround of Johannesburg under what was the most difficult coalition environment. And we're going to tell that story because ultimately they can tell the story of what people did in Cape Town 20 years ago. We're going to tell people the story of what we did in Joburg just a short while ago. And I think that memory is going to be much more recent and much more relevant in the eyes of the residents of that city. And we're going to tell that story for sure.
I'm curious, do you ever think there'll be a capacity for South Africa to move beyond personality politics? Because I think much of what's happening and even much of the questioning here to some extent exists at the fact that there is a lot of cross-pollination in the fact that people were part of historically different parties. I mean, you were once part of the DA, Herman Mashaba was once part of the DA. Similarly, if we look more to the left and we look at Julius Malema, we look at Jacob Zuma, all people who were once part of the ANC. What seems to be happening is that people are fracturing from these large major parties. And now what it feels like is if politicians are necessarily trying to deal with and gain vengeance on historical battles, historical fights that have taken place. Do we ever think there'll be a capacity for all parties to necessarily funnel in new candidates, people who we've never heard of, who might be able to say, actually, no, we're here to govern just for South Africans and we're not necessarily going to get involved at a personal level?
Look, let me just say this. Anyone who starts a political party for revenge purposes has a lot more energy and time on their hands than I do. Because starting a party and actually getting it to even a relative level of success is probably one of the hardest things you can do, from my point of view anyway. Just because the barriers to success are so high that quite frankly, I mean, there's got to be easier ways of getting revenge in life. But with that kind of aside, I think from our point of view, it's going to need a change to our electoral system. It's one of the things I believe really strongly in. I hate the system that South Africans vote for a political party and that political party gives you whoever suits them to give you. And let's be honest, quite often they're giving you the dregs of their parties that they just don't know what to do with them. So they give them to you, and you don't really have an option as to how you engage them. And because of that, the loyalty of that person is to their party who put them there, not to the voter who put their party there. And for us, that's really unhealthy. We want to see a change in our electoral system. We've made really strong representations to this kind of commission that's been set up by the Minister of Home Affairs. And we want to see a constituency-based system, at least a mixed system, where people go out and vote for an individual. Because what I want to see as a leadership figure in a political party is a situation where my people come to me saying, I can't vote the party line because my constituents want that. And you actually learn to respect that because that person was elected by those constituents, and I can't just tell this person what to do. And that'll be a really helpful situation when people feel that they can represent their residents, because accountability is to their residents first and foremost, ahead of the party. That's where I think we need to go as a country. And I also want to see more direct elections. People should be voting for their member of parliament, their premier, their president. And I mean, I don't want to call that personality politics because I don't think it is. It's about having direct lines of accountability to someone you can hold to account. If I said, phone your member of parliament right now, you wouldn't know who to phone. You got 400 and therefore none, all at the same time. And I think that particular part of political culture needs to change in South Africa.
I want to ask a question more looking forward to the future of South Africa, because I think there's two questions that probably frame it. Firstly, a major question around young people. Young people are continually disengaging with the system. And to some extent, you can't actually blame any of the new parties. It's very much historically the old big parties that have had the legacy and everything. But young people still ask the question, how do we get involved? Where do we get involved? And particularly from an ActionSA standpoint, what is the thing and the thinking around young people? But moreover, where do we think the development of young people can occur within the political space? Because what we are seeing is very, very old people, and I mean this in like their past retirement age, that continue to dominate, that continue to bring their constituency, continue to bring their old narratives, their old views of politics, and force them on young people. But beyond that, there's also this idea that many young people, though disillusioned, are unaware of how to get involved or aren't necessarily given the opportunity or the space. Because what we know in every election is young people are the first people to be spoken about. You young people, we can do these things for you. We can solve unemployment. We can give you education. We can give you the lot. But time and time again, it feels as though there's never a clear path for people to either, one, engage political parties, or two, to really say, here are the places in which we can organize and come together and provide our ideas and make sure that they're being platformed.
Yeah, so I think just as a little joke to start off with, I think in many political parties, you can be about 65 and still part of the youth structure. That's kind of how it works at the moment. But if you look at South African youth, it is a really sad story because they are by far the biggest victims of failed politics. Mm-hmm. The highest unemployment rate in this country is young people. And for us, this is something that just makes it so much worse that young people feel disconnected from their politics, and their politics is disconnected from them. It's something that we're very keen to turn around. And, for us, there is no silver bullet. It's got to be about taking up the fights of young people and doing it regularly and routinely, and making sure as a party we have young people in our decision-making structures, that when we are talking about issues, the youth agenda is always on the table. We're quite blessed that way. I mean, the average age of an ActionSA candidate in this 2024 national and provincial elections was 39.
Wow.
Which is quite interesting. I mean, that's a hell of a lot younger than most parties. But
by a mile.
By a long way. But no, we do it deliberately. We actually have capacitation programs for our candidates where we target demographics that are traditionally underrepresented. So young people and women are particularly underrepresented in politics. And we have programs that are designed to ensure that by the time that person gets to a candidate application, they can compete on an even playing field, and they got the information and the experience and the skills. So we're big on that, but not all parties are. But I am convinced as long as you have what you have in the South African Parliament, which is, the old age home of politics, the youth agenda is never going to be on the table because If you look at that group of people, I mean, they are so wildly disconnected from the lives of young people today, and yet they are responsible for it. And that, until that changes, I can't see that we're going to be able to really change the dynamic with young people in South Africa.
The second question I asked, which is a follow-up to that, is a question around nation building, because I think South Africa is in a very interesting place. We have certain things that we can ascertain to being part of our national identity, whether it's rugby, whether it's women football. We have elements and moments where South Africa comes together as a country and is able to buy into this idea of being a collective. Of course, at the birth of liberation was the Rainbow Nation, which kind of has faded into this idea and disillusionment amongst many young South Africans. What do you necessarily think is the way forward, and what do we necessarily attain to the parts that are going to be a part of building our nation? Because I think there's more divides happening in different capacities, whether it's an age divide, whether it's a conversation around immigration within South Africa. There's many instances where we're starting to divide many of the people who make up South Africa. They might not all be South African, but they make up the constituency and represent a lot of the people who are here. What do you guys say then to the national identity that we could be building, and what does the future potentially look like?
I think the problem with the discussion on nation building, or before that it was reconciliation or the Rainbow Nation, is it's taken place absent success and growth, which is a problem. Because I love sport. I love those moments more than the average person, I can tell you. But very soon after those trophies are lifted and we've put down the last beer in celebration, people go back to being unemployed. People go back to living in places that don't have electricity and toilets and dignity. And life continues, and we all just say, well, no, wasn't it great? And it was great. But, all of the discussion around nation building is taking place in our sports and our kind of artists and the people we should be celebrating that level, very little bit in our politics. And if you look at the biggest problem in South Africa is until we have unemployment being addressed, until we have the economy growing, until you have more people who have a pathway from leaving school to starting a business, these are all issues that are going to ensure that the kind of prevailing atmosphere is not one of nation building. And as long as you have the legacy of our past being so heavily reflected in terms of opportunity and access to opportunity, there will be no nation building and there will be no unity in South Africa. And that's why it's so urgent that we address this, because this is something that's time-bound. People cannot live like this forever. It has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed with urgency and in a deliberate manner. But I don't think people in power understand that. And you see politicians who like to dance around on sports fields and try to take the acclaim of that moment for themselves, and it's not theirs. Because when they go into the union buildings or into parliament, they're the ones that are dividing South Africa the most.
I want to ask about this question around growth, because it seems to be time and time again this thing that all political parties keep talking to. And I think what's very telling, particularly about the GNU and the fact that they're in government, is that that growth has no number. So it's not, are we reaching for 3%? Are we reaching for 6%? It feels as though growth is very much this arbitrary figure that exists, and this arbitrary thing that's meant to bring all this goodness and all this success for many South Africans. When we speak about growth, what are South Africans meant to be looking at? Because, of course, we know from the last quarter, 0.1% growth, risks of a recession in South Africa potentially if we have 2 negative quarters. The picture is starting to look dire. Now that we're seeing a lot more participants from different political parties, ActionSA is starting to play a hand. When you guys speak about growth, what does that necessarily mean, and what does that look like?
So let me just start by saying this GNU government hasn't told us any number, which is the first problem, because what a government needs to do, especially a change government, is it needs to come in and say, these are our priorities, these are our non-priorities, because you can't have priorities without a non-priority. This is what we're going to invest in. Look at this budget and how we're increasing investment into the kind of priorities. These are the national KPIs going forward. We want to bring unemployment down to this level. We want to pick up growth to that level, etc. That's what it should have done. It never did that. And it's one of its original sins, because from that moment onwards, it's just adrift in the sea. And that's why we actually produced a GNU tracker. It's on our website. We market it on a daily basis, where we are tracking what we think they should have done as the national KPIs, because in the absence of government doing it, the opposition's having to do it now. But from a growth point of view, there needed to be a major statement of change. There was a first impression moment for this new government to really do something special and to change the perception of South Africa domestically and abroad, and make a couple of big statements about our economy that really could have been a bit of a lift-off moment for us. It required clear economic policy to say, we're not going to be wishy-washy anymore. We're not going to say this to that audience and that to that audience. We're going to say the same to all audiences. To really look at the barriers to entry, to look at the subjects of transformation, which at the moment, unless you've got access to the system, you can't benefit from transformation policies in our country. And to look at all of the issues that are holding our economy back and to produce meaningful direction there. That is what had to happen, and it hasn't happened. So for us, that's what it would have required, and it required massively bold leadership. We can't continue to talk about 1.9%, revised down to 1.4%. Now we've got the US trade tariffs coming in on the 1st of August. They say down by another 0.3 there. And we always end up under 1%. If growth is anything less than 5%, we're not going to be able to address the needs of this country in any meaningful way. But even then, economic growth and the idea of trickle-down economics is not going to do it itself. We have to ask ourselves about what kind of skills we're putting out to the marketplace and what kind of strategy South Africa has in the global economy. I think strategy is the missing word in South African government, because what people don't see in this country is a strategy through which international relations and economic moves and everything fall into line within a single strategy. There is no strategy, and that's why when we face a crisis like we do with the US trade tariffs right now, we're not being governed by economic self-interest, being governed by other considerations. So for us, there has to be strategy that makes that very clear, and there needs to be the required change. But this is where the big kind of question of political will comes in. Do people in power have the willingness to take tough decisions, to reduce the size of the civil service, to say to unions, you have a seat at the table, but it's not your table, to say to educators, you will teach children and your union rights come second to that particular priority, to say to our police that you can investigate anyone and you will never be fired or sidelined or put on eternal leave if you investigate the wrong person. These are all things that require political will, but there doesn't appear to be that political will in the parties involved in this GNU.
Khumo actually asked the question I wanted to ask. But I really wanted to now just lead with the focus on, it's a few months after the scandals of Washington and the AfriForum, what you'd call pilgrimages to the US to go speak to the American president. Some of the things that still remain as impediments to South Africa actually getting a trade deal with the US is transformation legislation. The White House says BEE, triple BEE, and those types of policies are restrictive, are racist, and should be scrapped. The leader of ActionSA, Herman Mashaba, has said that he does not particularly like these policies of BEE and triple BEE. I want to know, what are ActionSA's core beliefs on what transformation legislation should look like, and how would you guys have stood up, or rather worked diplomatically in the White House had it been you guys there and not President Ramaphosa and John Steenhuisen?
Okay. So let me say from the outset, and this was even before the pilgrimage to Washington, that we've always stood against BEE. But the way we phrase it is important, is that we stand for the empowerment of black South Africans. We stand against the BEE Act of 2003, which we believe that is the failing point. And what the ANC has done in this country is created a narrative that if you're against BEE, you're against transformation. It's absolute nonsense. You can be pro-transformation and look for alternatives, because if you look at the country and where it is, if you're going to look at me seriously and tell me that BEE has worked, then we aren't living on the same planet. I mean, if you go into communities that are impoverished right now and you talk about BEE, you'll get chased out of there, because people are angry. They've never had access to those opportunities, and they're very angry about it. So we do believe that there must be an alternative. We put forward personally a policy belief in ActionSA we call inclusive economic empowerment. We're not just playing with letters of the alphabet here. We believe that you have to remove the barriers for a person to access transformational opportunities. And that means a huge investment in education. We believe in starting up a empowerment fund and saying to businesses, let's take away all of your BE compliance costs, which are measured apparently about 1.5 trillion rand a year, and have those paid as a tax to create an empowerment fund. And from that empowerment fund, government invests in record levels of education and infrastructure in communities that are far behind, and do what we can to even those playing fields. But ultimately, the challenge for us is that BEE itself, as a policy, has not succeeded. And that's why we think there has to be change in that regard. As a matter of fact, we have tabled a resolution in the National Assembly to call for a review of BEE. It's a Rule 117 resolution, which basically we're saying this thing hasn't worked, but we want to initiate a process in the South African Parliament that's going to be owned by all parties and say, let's review this, let's look at how it has performed over time, and let's review alternatives, because we think that is necessary. But we don't think on the other side of the argument it's helpful to say, because BE has failed, we just do nothing. Because the inequality in this country is not going to sort itself out by gravity. It has to be dealt with in a decisive manner, and it has to be dealt with by a government that is deliberate in the course of its actions. In terms of the relationships with the US, I think in real terms, what you're looking at now is just the symptoms of what's been happening for a long time. And I think there's a lot of people being used as useful idiots by Washington, because actually what Washington is very angry about is the long-term alienation of that relationship, which, there's no question South Africa has alienated that relationship. We have taken every opportunity to try and stick our fingers in the eyes of the US, and to our own self-detriment. And this is where ANC international relations is really confusing, because it's Cold War international relations. It's based on the idea that Cuba is an ally of South Africa. Now, I am a big believer in the idea that there were countries that were good to South Africa in the struggle and countries that were bad to South Africa in the struggle. I know that. But it is many years later, and we need to define our relationships with the world based on our own self-interest. That's how every successful country in the world does it. And to think that, creating friendships with countries that alienate the US is going to help us is absolutely nuts. That certainly has been what has happened. And we're staring down the barrel of those consequences coming on Friday. It's a scary prospect. And I think that relationship needed to be nursed far better. Firstly, you have to have the right people there. As we speak right now, our special envoy to Washington is taking podcasts in Sandton at the moment. We don't have an ambassador. We don't have a trade team hammering out a deal there. And I think the worst part is the South African people are completely in the dark. What was negotiated in Washington? What did we promise? What did they say were conditions placed upon us? We have no idea as South Africans what these things are, because no one is playing open cards with us. And can you imagine for one moment, and put yourself in the shoes of a business owner in agriculture or in commodities or in one of those fields that's about automotive industry, that's staring down that barrel of 40% trade tariffs coming into effect on Friday. They'd have no idea what's going to happen on Friday right now. And I think that level of uncertainty is deeply alarming, and this whole thing should have been dealt with a whole lot better. But from our point of view, it required a long-term approach to defining international relations strategy based on human rights and economic self-interest.
I want to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you for what you've done. I think you've opened my mind quite a lot in terms of where South Africa could go. And I think a big thing that I want to say is that you've given a lot of clarity to where South Africa should be, because I think that's what's been missing. There hasn't necessarily been people who've been calling for a clear path, a clear solution. And as you said, the thing that's missing in South Africa at the moment is strategy. Quickly in closing, what I do want to ask, ANC, DA, both of them are going into an elective conference in the next 2 years. Does ActionSA care for any of those, or are you guys purely looking internally in your own politics?
No, we are going through a process of internally democratizing our own structures. People place a big premium on elective conferences for understandable reasons, but actually democratizing from the ground up is something you need to get right. You can't just start at a national elective conferences. You've got to build up from branches. And that's what we're doing right now. We're having that debate as to when ours will be held. Okay. But at the same time, we're also quite calm because the people who seem to be most aggravated about us not having an elective conference are from other parties. And I always say to people, if you want to have a say, take out ActionSA membership and raise your voice. But we're not going to be guided by our opponents as to how we should operate internally either.
Oof. I want to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming onto our platform. To everyone at Born Free, subscribe, comment, like, and as always, we're going to be bringing more hard-hitting interviews. We're going to be speaking about South Africa, and we're going to be planning the future out with you. Yeah. Peace out.